The media's impact on our environment didn't start yesterday. It stretches at least to the chemical and mechanical processes that brought about printing's dubious shift to deforestation to meet the growing appetite for paper in the latter half of the 19th century. Fueled by steam and streamside power, effluents from paper mills carried toxic components of waste from trees. This was the cost of the print media investing 19th and 20th century citizenship with new powers of commerce, culture, and political participation, which we so readily celebrate. Waterways were fouled and forests denuded as the US monopoly company International Paper fed advertising's growing demand for blank pages in which to print their blandishments. Entering the 20th century, paper demand strained the US monopoly and forced open paper trade talks with Canada, which ended up binding the forests of the top of North America to the ecological practice of advertising-based print media. There was resistance to this. In 1920, a greenish congressperson from Ohio sought to stem deforestation by taxing 10% of this space, and I quote, to teach advertisers to tell their stories in less room and thus conserve the use of paper and curtail enormous waste now quite evident and admitted, unquote. His draft legislation, needless to say, failed, and the Association of National Advertisers has staved off further attempts to tax expanding media use based on the claim of the need for democratic speech. By the 1920s, of course, when he made that unsuccessful attempt to legislate, pulping and paper-making processes had also taught our friends over at Eastman Kodak, those of you in film studies will know all about this, how to make cellulose acetate, or safety film, which famously replaced the unstable film stock of early cinematography. By the 1990s, the United States supplied over 80% of such technology around the world. As a corollary, in 2000, Eastman Kodak became the primary source of dioxin released into New York State's environment. And ever since 1987, the company's hometown, Rochester, boasts the greatest exposure to carcinogenic chemicals of any US municipality. Media convergence takes on new meaning in this ecological context. Print and film were bound by the same chemical processes that poisoned land and water and diminished the Earth's already diminished ability to absorb the airborne pathogens that have contributed to climate change. And the most significant point of the media's technological convergence is, of course, electricity. From the batteries that powered telegraph and telephone to the large national grids that made our radios, TVs, and telematic networks buzz with information and fun. Not surprisingly, electricity consumption has been the media's single biggest contribution to environmental despoliation. Citizenship is again caught in a contradictory pose, seduced by the allure of iPods, MacBook Airs, cell phones, plasma screens, and connectivity. Citizens who know about the ecological context of media convergence, from occupational hazards to high-tech trash heaps, may question their investments. I haven't got time to go through some examples of that, but I want to move on to what might green citizenship involve were it to evolve. Green citizens would need to develop an ethical orientation to human relationships with non-human nature, drawing on anthropocentric, ecocentric ethics, or some midpoint between them. These schools, as you will be aware, those of you who are philosophically inclined, differ over questions of value, what matters, which entities qualify for moral consideration, and which ones matter most. They differ over rights, duties and rules that protect individual and collective entities that have moral standing, and they differ over consequences, utilitarian considerations of actions and motives that affect collective well-being. For anthropocentric ecoethics, non-human nature has no status other than in relation to how people are affected by changes in nature, and hence it has no rights. By contrast, ecocentric ethics holds that nature is the ultimate source of value. Some or all natural beings in the broadest sense have independent moral status on this line. An intermediate form of ecological ethics accords intrinsic value to non-human nature, but not as completely as does ecocentrism. It's not fully anthropocentric, though it agrees that humans' moral status can be extended to other sentient beings, primarily non-human animals. While I can imagine green citizens giving precedence to the earth in their deliberations, at some point, anthropocentric ecoethics offers a pragmatic starting point. We have to begin somewhere, and a good place might be the shrouded, abject past and present foreshadowed in my earlier reference to Mexico City, with which I'll be concluding. From the first days of the printing press in Europe, itinerant rag pickers supplied raw materials to that industry, gathered from rubbish in large pre-industrial European towns. Waste removal from city centres expanded because of the anxieties of the urban rich, who condemned the odour of crowded bodies and the rising tide of excrement and rubbish. The rag pickers typified urban untouchables: sewermen, gut dressers, knackers, drain cleaners, workers in refuse dumps, and dredging gangs. Removal meant the displacement of waste, but not its elimination. As a living, malodorous reminder of urban filth, the lowly rag picker foiled bourgeois fantasies of cleanliness. Charles Baudelaire famously portrayed these pioneering recyclers as defenders of the poor and enemies of the rich. And rag pickers were figures of pathos in the British situation comedy of the 1960s, Steptoe and Son. Anybody ever seen this program? One or two. On which the Yankee show Sanford and Son was based. Anybody seen Sanford and Son? The Steptoes and their horse and cart looked for gems amongst the dross of so-called swinging London. They represented throwbacks to a time that had not really passed for working people. Steptoe Jr. spent his evenings dreaming of transcendence, devouring the works of George Bernard Shaw and Karl Marx, but he could never leave his rag picker status behind. Rag pickers survive to this day, embarrassing, abject embodiments of post-industrial progress and the pull of capitalism, urging more and more chaotic urban growth, as per Mexico City's sprawling deterioration and sprawling regeneration. The location of most digital age landfills follows a pattern, not surprisingly, set in the 19th century. The deodorization of public space remains highly stratified. The richest regions use the poorest as dumping grounds for noxious electronic junk. Last year, over 80% of e-waste was exported to the poorest quarters of the geographical periphery, leaving contemporary rag pickers the job of removing and recycling first world refuse. Consider Lagos. 100,000 personal computers entered the port each month last year, 75,000 of them unusable other than as scrap. Or consider Guiyu, China's principal dump. It boasts over 5,000 rag pickers, many of them preteen girls picking away at dangerous materials with little or no protection. It's a place where 82% of the city's children aged under 6 suffer lead poisoning. Epidemiological studies of Delhi rag pickers, who number over 300,000, indicate that they have an historically unprecedented prevalence of low hemoglobin, high monocyte and eosinophil counts, gum disease, diarrhea, and dermatitis. In Brazil, where it's estimated that there are 500,000 rag pickers, extraordinary levels of physiological disorder and psychological distress are reported. E-waste plays a major part, and it's our e-waste. Many of us on the left in the human sciences are dedicated to learning from and working with the oppressed, their creativity and their suffering. The rag picker could become a lodestone as a means of adding a green citizenship that emanates from below to our existing political, economic and cultural forms of citizenship. The burden on their bodies from overconsumption of toxic media confronts our own commitments to a technological sublime, and I hope makes us talk more rubbish.